Russia's move towards professional armed forces. A 28-minute presentation held at the Allenblock Lecture Theatre in the Joint Services Command and Staff College, Shrewsbury, on the 10th of October 2007. The speaker is Mr. Keir Giles of the Advanced Research Agency Group and BBC Monitoring. Mr. Keir Giles.
Well, I'll be talking about one particular aspect of Russia's force transformation that's ongoing at the moment, and that is the move from a conscript army to a semi-professional army. I'll be talking about that for about 20 plus minutes, and then we'll have plenty of time afterwards for questions. I'm going to look first of all, for the folks who aren't too familiar with the basic parameters, at some of the things that have changed in Russia's military since we last looked at it closely. We got very accustomed over the 1990s, beginning of this century, to thinking of Russian military as being chronically and permanently underfunded and therefore broken and incapable, but that's very much no longer the case. There is a massive amount of money going into the Russian military now. Depending on your assessment of China, they're either the second or the third biggest spender in the world in absolute terms now, after the USA, which is a huge change. They are throwing vast amounts of money at re-equipment over the next 8 years. And for the first time, they have a real, true civilian defense minister, ex-businessman, ex-tax accountant, apparently in charge of making sure the money goes where it is supposed to go instead of into the pockets of the generals and the procurement companies. But even so, there's only so much money you can throw at something before at least some of it begins to stick. So some of the long-term problems that they've been suffering from over the past 18 years since the end of the Soviet Union are now being resolved. In particular, the amount of money that they're paying the soldiers. We always think of them as being hopelessly underpaid. No longer exactly the case. And particularly, they are now training at a level and intensity that hasn't been seen in the last 18 years. They are incredibly busy. All of this ties in with the new defense doctrine they're drafting at the moment. As their Chief of General Staff, Barlievsky, said in January this year, they reckon now that conflict is inevitable, and the number one enemy is once again NATO in general, USA in particular. So they want to do something about it. Whereas most of the heartache about the state of the Russian armed forces in the 90s was they felt they needed powerful armed forces as an essential attribute of great power status. Now they need it as a tool to carry out specific tasks. And they're sharpening that tool by replacing some of their conscripts in some of their units with professional servicemen, so-called contract servicemen. So what I'll be looking at is what they actually wanted to achieve by doing this, some of the problems that they've come up against along the way, some of them self-inflicted, some of them objective, and why, in my considered opinion, it's going to go horribly wrong next year and the year after that. We're now at the end of a 4-year program that they've had for introducing these contract servicemen. So what you've got today is almost a kind of end-of-term report on how they've actually managed it. And the news isn't all good for them. First of all, why did they want to do it? I'll run fairly briskly through some of the things that they wanted to achieve by contractization, and then we'll have a look at some of the key points in a bit more detail later on. They wanted servicemen that they could actually train to use a new generation of weapons. Their procurement program involves replacing the vast numbers of basic conscript-proof kit that they had previously with high-tech weaponry. And in particular, they wanted to allow the informatization of the armed forces to get away from a pen and paper-based military. They wanted to set up real permanent readiness units, ones that were actually capable of doing something, and they realized that the conscription program was not succeeding in getting in the servicemen that they actually needed. At the same time, they're cutting the term of conscription from 2 years to 1 and trying to remove all conscripts from all conflict zones. They've been aiming for that for several years now. They hope finally to achieve it. They thought that having professional servicemen would actually do something to restore the image of the military in Russian society. And most of all, they wanted to set up a real core of effective NCOs and end the appalling practice of selecting conscripts at random in the early stages of their service and baptizing them as sergeants with minimal training and zero experience. What about what they needed to achieve in order to do this? The overall numbers of contract servicemen look fairly small. It's only an increase of about 125,000 out of a total armed forces of 1.1 million, give or take. But for each of those 125,000, they wanted to set up brand new living standard facilities so that they were very different from the standards for conscripts. In some cases, some of this had to be built from scratch. Huge increases in pay to bring people in the first place. Increasing the intensity of training and the level to which they're trained. And this last objective I've included from the contractization program because it looks on the face of it curiously unambitious, but it does give you an indication of the scale of the problem they were dealing with to start with. Instead of saying that they need to have new modern equipment for all contract servicemen, the only objective they had in the program was that the contract servicemen should have all of the equipment which Russian servicemen are supposed to be entitled to in the first place, unlike the conscripts. And there's an ongoing debate in the Russian military, depending on who you ask. Either they're going to roll out professional servicemen to the whole of the armed forces, or it will happen over their dead body, which is what you hear most of the time. What about the aims and objectives? What about permanent readiness units? Russia has always had them in theory. But here is what himself had to say about the time when they actually needed to employ them in 1999, Second Chechen War. It wasn't good news. It was a vast improvement on their performance in getting together units to fight the First Chechen War, but they were still in trouble. They realized that the permanent readiness units weren't actually capable of fulfilling any of the tasks that they were supposed to. Now, there was another event at roughly the same time which focused their minds on what their permanent readiness units should be able to do, and that is the movement of the airborne assault forces to Pristina in Kosovo in June 1999. Sold at home as a great feat of arms and a great achievement, but the people on the ground knew perfectly well that they wouldn't have been able to move without US funding, and they wouldn't have been able to stay in Pristina without British support. So, now they are restructuring the airborne assault forces with the aim of being able to do it properly and do it independently. And they want to be capable of, quote, preventing threats from arising, including abroad, unquote. And if I were a close neighbor of Russia, those are words which would give me some pause for thought, especially if I were a close neighbor of Russia who was considering playing host to something which the Russians have already stated they consider a strategic threat, for example, anti-missile defense. How about training and education? The basic educational requirement to be a contract serviceman is a complete secondary education. This is totally different from what you have with conscripts. Now, interestingly, the number of people with a higher education who are now entering the armed forces as conscripts has suddenly received a pretty major boost. From practically zero in the last two conscription campaigns, it's gone up to about 15%. Where have they all come from, you might ask? Well, it's a simple administrative thing. They've abolished the military faculties in higher education institutions. So previously, those who had a degree and had been through a military faculty would have been drafted as the so-called two-year lieutenants, as officers, a kind of Russian short-service limited commission. Now they've been abolished, they're being drafted into the ranks. And so the inevitable consequence, which we assume we're going to be hearing about in about a year, 18 months from now, is going to be a massive shortfall of people to fill junior officer posts. The other basic aim that they want to achieve is having people in the forces who can use computers. They're not achieving it through conscription. The level of penetration of computer and internet use within Russia is a lot lower than in Western Europe and in other parts of the world. And those who can use the internet, by definition, are the ones who can get access to all of the abundant information on how to avoid being conscripted in the first place. So they need to find another way of getting them in. The overall numbers being conscripted, they are known for some time that it's going to be a problem. The main Organization and Mobilization Directorate has been saying for years that they're going to run out of conscripts. Back in 2001, Vladislav Putilin, the then head of the directorate, said that the system was going to run into the ground in 2007 because they were going to run out. Well, it didn't quite happen. He didn't get his arithmetic wrong. It's just that the armed forces have shrunk even further in between by another 300,000 men. It's postponed the problem. It hasn't made it go away. And the underlying root cause of this is the same as what is posing problems for Russia in all sorts of other fields, social, economic, geographic, and it all comes down to the demography. Moving up to the end of the Soviet Union, Russian society goes into convulsions. They stop having children. That was 18 years ago. Now those unborn Russians, where the birth rate suddenly dropped off a cliff around 1988, 1990, are the ones who should be coming into the workforce and coming into the armed forces, and they haven't adjusted their view of how they're going to manage the armed forces to take account of the fact that there are just not enough people there. They're still fixated on the idea of having a mass army in order to provide mass mobilization resources, mass reserves. So, where do they fill the gap? They're looking to recruit professional soldiers. The recruitment campaigns, the advertising on the internet and on television, it all looks great. It's a man's life in the army. A military service by contract, it's the right choice for you. So it's 3-year contracts, 3, 5 or 10 years, but most people seem to be signing up for only 3 years. It is running from 2004. Most of those who signed up seem to be in the late stages of 2005, early 2006. They're throwing a lot of money at them, not only the increased pay scales, but also incentives for joining, for rejoining, housing benefits, grants for moving to join the units. And they hope that by doing this, they will have at least those arms of service which require the most skill and the most training fully professional in the fairly near future. In the early stages, recruitment didn't go too badly. Trouble is, they haven't been able to hang on to them. And this is mostly as a result of an institutional failure to realize that volunteers are not the same people as conscript servicemen, and you cannot treat them in the same way. So, for example, they are all supposed to have modernized accommodation of the kind that you're looking at here. This is what they call cabin-type accommodation instead of the vast echoing dormitories of beds jammed together that you would put conscripts in. But in the early stages, they just didn't actually bother to build them. So the contract servicemen would sign up, arrive in their unit, discover that they weren't being provided with what they had been promised under the contract, and surprise, surprise, they walked away again because they could, because they're volunteers, because they're not coerced to be there. This came as a huge surprise. Another indication of how they haven't quite grasped who they're dealing with, they failed to realize that if somebody has completed his term of conscription, gone away for 3 or 4 years, and come back in as a contract serviceman, they might quite possibly have acquired a family in between. And they didn't provide any married quarters. So family accommodation was exactly the same as this, just down the corridor, which is unlikely to be conducive to harmonious marital relations. And once again, the married servicemen leave. The concept of young officers passing out, arriving in a unit, and having to command soldiers who are older and more experienced than them is something that we've known about forever. For the Russians, it's a big surprise. They've never had to deal with it before. There are plenty of Russian translations for how to give orders. There is no Russian translation for the word leadership, and it's not taught. It's something which is giving them a lot of grief, and they're having trouble getting accustomed to it. But conversely, the volunteers, the contract servicemen coming in, are also not realizing that contract service is not going to be like the lap of luxury they had in the last 6 months as a conscript, and they actually have to work for a living. So there's a crisis of expectations on both sides. A lot of the things that they are being paid extra for being contract servicemen work fine if you are coming from an economically depressed rural area where there's no alternative work, but if your salary expectations are those of somebody living in Moscow or St. Petersburg, it's really not as good. The housing account is supposed to buy you a flat in a provincial city at the end of a couple of contract terms. It's not keeping up with real price increases trickling out from the big cities. And the fact that you can serve for just 3 years is a big problem, because although people are expected to re-sign their contracts at the end of those 3 years, according to the Russian Ministry of Defense's own figures, only up to about 20% of the current contract servicemen are going to do that. And that's in addition to the ones who have left, who have broken their contracts early because they weren't provided with what they were promised. So, at the end of that 3 years, in 2008-2009, they're going to have to start the recruitment process all over again. There's a knock-on effect on how they're actually managing to recruit. The fact that the failures of the recruitment program so far have been pretty well publicized means that nobody else is interested in signing up at the moment. The recruitment program seems, according to some figures, to have more or less ground to a halt. Pay scales we've already mentioned. One of the things they wanted to get away from was the poor kids from rural areas making up the bulk of the forces, but the way they've got it structured at the moment is perpetuating that. And we're getting more and more reports that in order to make up the numbers, conscripts are being forced to sign their contracts. But of course, as soon as they possibly can, these forced volunteers unvolunteer themselves, and that churn, that turnover, doesn't actually show up in the official figures. But last month, the head of the Mobilization Directorate said that even though they were coming to the end of the 4-year program, aiming to recruit 125,000 professionals, they still had a shortfall of 41,000. So the program as a whole is in big trouble. And crucially, for the rest of their forced transformation program, the idea of having all NCOs as professional servicemen has failed utterly. There's now a new program that they're planning where the deadline is not 2007, but 2011. We can see what kind of effect this kind of failure has if we look at another key part of their force transformation, which is setting up mountain infantry brigades. There are two of them planned for the North Caucasus, one in Botlich, which some of you might remember is where the Second Chechen War kicked off, an incursion into Dagestan, and one further north in Karachay-Cherkessia. They were supposed to be made up of new contract servicemen brought in, interested in being mountain specialists. The investment that they put into to building this garrison town in what was effectively previously high mountain pasture was absolutely huge. Here we've got the other problem too in other contract units. They've nearly built all of the facilities, so the things are in place for the contract servicemen to arrive, but they weren't able to recruit them. So in the end, what they had to do was strip other units in order to bring men in. And although they're extremely proud of what they're managing, it's the high mountain training. Here's a Krasnaya Zvezda, Red Star, Ministry of Defense newspaper from just a couple of weeks ago saying, aren't they great, we're higher than everybody. If you read between the lines, you see that actually they are having to relearn all mountain experience from scratch. Similarly, the television footage of the exercises that they've been doing at high altitudes looks brilliant, but then, unfortunately, there's the obligatory interview with the fittest-looking bloke available who says, well, I'm doing okay, it's not so hard for me, I'm the only one in my platoon who's been up a mountain before. So instead of adding capability, they've actually had to remove it from other units in order to build these new brigades, including from the Interior Ministry. So they're coming in not just from Ministry of Defense units, but stripping out other armed forces as well. What about next year? What about 2008? There are a number of factors coming together which will probably derail most of their programs for improving the human resources in the armed forces. The biggest one is conscription. I mentioned they are reducing the conscription term from 2 years to 1. Here are the different conscription intakes and demobilization for the various terms. We're here in October, just starting the second of two 18-month transitional periods between 2 years and 12 months. But the effect of that is that at these 2 points here, we have not one but two draft intakes simultaneously leaving the army. That adds up to over 500,000 experienced conscripts leaving instead of the normal 130,000, 140,000. In other words, more than half of the armed forces leaves, and that's in addition to those contract servicemen who have reached the end of their contract and are not renewing. So picture any kind of large organization that within about a 6 to 8 month period loses more than half of its ground level workforce, and that more than half is the ones who know how everything works. They're the most experienced one. And it would take an extremely robust institution to survive that kind of hemorrhaging of brains without some kind of severe organizational shock. And I don't think the Russian armed forces yet, despite all the improvements over the last few years, can claim to be that robust. So, further reading. If you would like afterwards, if you're interested in any of this, to take a look at some of the previous CSRC publications. I've brought a few up there. But I shall stop there and over to questions if you wish.
Mr. Giles was asked the following 12 questions. Question 1. What is the condition of the Russian Navy compared with the Army?
Well, the Navy, as you probably know, always had a longer conscription term because it was recognized in Soviet times that a greater level of training was needed than just to put an AK in somebody's hands and let them leap out of a blimp. That is continuing. They do have more and more professional servicemen manning the new vessels that are coming in. There is a parallel between the Navy and the Army in that some of the new equipment that they're bringing in is contract servicemen only. So the new vessels that are coming into the Caspian Flotilla, for example, Makhachkala, and the new airborne IFV, the BND-4, has been designated conscripts hands-off. So depending on which forecast you read, it looks as though they may well achieve an all-professional Navy by 2009, which is a long, long way before they'll be looking at the bulk of the rest of the armed forces.
Question 2. Is the shipbuilding industry and its infrastructure receiving the same injection as the military?
No, really, it's the reverse program that's going on. It's the Rosoboronexport, the former former and current defense exporting body, is actually swallowing up and renationalizing large parts of both aviation and shipbuilding and ground forces production. But of that $189 billion figure for procurement, 25% of that is for new shipbuilding, and they're talking about a 30-year program building up to aircraft carriers in the longer future.
Question 3. Is the figure of 6 aircraft carriers realistic?
It didn't look realistic until he described that it was a very long-term aim. If you look at the kind of trouble they've had trying to rebuild the carrier for the Indians, where the date's been pushed back and back, it doesn't look as they can do it at the moment, but they're considering beginning that carrier building program in 2015, after having had, if you like, a little practice with intermediate sizes of warship.
Question 4. Is there any evidence of Russia's neighbours getting worried?
Well, if you think specifically of the Western neighbours, then the Russians are already testing out just how far they can push NATO in the EU. Think Estonia, think gas pipelines. And they've probably, as a result of that, got a fairly good idea of just how far they can go to annoy their neighbours in the West. Looking eastwards, of course, you've got new structures where they are looking to set up cooperative forces with their eastern and southern neighbours instead of having this direct confrontation that we have here. For relations with China, relations with Central Asia, I would refer you to some back CSRC publications. It is something that other colleagues have looked at in more depth and would be better qualified to answer than I.
Question 5. Why is Russia targeting NATO as an enemy?
There are all sorts of different levels of depth you could go into there. To put it at its simplest, let's pick an image. Let's think back to Soviet times and the old pictures, the old Soviet propaganda pictures of Russia, the Soviet Union being surrounded by NATO missiles from the north, from the south, from the oceans. That same picture is now reappearing in the Russian media, but the key difference is everything that they perceive as a threat is now that much closer, especially in Western Europe, because their near abroad is now hosting NATO forces. There are a number of different things that they have said. Specifically, we regard this as a threat. US bases in Romania, for example. They have hinted that there is a trigger point for how far they can be built up before they actually consider it a strategic threat, and by logical extension from all the other things they're saying, take some kind of action against them.
Question 6. In terms of how the Russian military look at the world, how far into the immediate future do you think they look for triggers such as Crimea and Georgia?
Well, they're probably slightly different things. Sevastopol, it comes up again and again, but the roadmap for how that's going to develop is probably fairly clear. Yes, they will make a big fuss about it for all of the remaining time until they have built the new Black Sea Fleet facilities in Novorossiysk, and then it'll probably all go quiet. Georgia and South Ossetia is one of the areas where they have been practicing most assiduously for actually doing something military about it. Over the last 2 years, we've had exercise Caucasus Border, which is, quote, counter-terrorist exercise, unquote, but involves moving their permanent readiness units down to the immediate northern area of the Rocky Pass through into South Ossetia, and practicing moving right up and presumably carrying straight on. Both of those at times when you have the traditional high point of summer tension between Russia and Georgia. So of the two, Georgia/South Ossetia is going to be the one to watch.
Question 7. Is there a shift in public attitude towards the military?
Yeah, up to a point, but there are several different strands that go into that. Yes, people don't want their nearest and dearest to be conscripted because they've heard all of the tales about the hazing and the bullying and the lousy food. That is gradually changing because they've addressed a lot of those issues just over the past year or so. In fact, the second paper there, which by all means help yourself to one, is specifically about how they're improving the pay and conditions for Russian servicemen and getting rid of some of the worst things about serving in the army. But that's a slightly different issue to it being very deep in the Russian consciousness that, yes, they do need to have powerful armed forces for whatever reason. One of the key phrases that keeps coming up is they don't respect us anymore because they're not afraid of us. Never mind defending Russia, we have to have a powerful army anyway. Question
8. Are they able to keep the budget sustained? And do the people think it should be used on other projects like healthcare?
Well, as to whether it's sustainable, yeah, it's a key question. It's all funded on oil revenues. What happens when those oil revenues tail off? Let's not forget that there is the simply enormous stabilization fund where they've been creaming off a certain level of oil revenues for some unspecified future crisis. It's entirely possible that unspecified future crisis could be funding the military. As for competition with other projects, this isn't the only area where there is massively increased state funding. All of the other federal targeted programs, like the one on healthcare, are also receiving lots and lots of money. But one of the key differences between them is that the military budget, the defense budget overall, and let's not forget it spills over from what's specifically defense into all sorts of things like education, housing, sport, etc., is not voted on by Parliament, is not seen by anybody. It is presented by the military to be approved, and then it is.
Question 9. Is it a misdirection that Russia's main threat comes from Europe or NATO, or should they be more concerned with the Far East?
Well, let me take that in reverse order. Yes, they are investing all the way across Russia. A large number of the permanent readiness units are actually south-facing. In terms of how they're playing the Chinese threat, again, it depends who you ask. The cooperative exercises with the Chinese are all portrayed as how to work with the Chinese in future in joint operations. Ask mid-level military officers, and the answer is, well, it's so we can get a good look at them to see what we're up against. As to which is portrayed as the greater threat, the draft doctrine, the conclusion of the conference on draft doctrine was that the most likely military armed conflict scenario that they're facing at the moment is some kind of limited military conflict with NATO around Russia's periphery. No more specific than that.
Question 10. Are they using military education as an incentive?
Absolutely. That's one of the things that they've actually started to introduce with conscripts, even not just contract servicemen, a basic professional education in a particular trade that you're working in the armed forces. But the amount of fuss and screaming that greeted that shows how much resistance there is in the army as a whole to people doing anything other than basic soldering. Question
11. Do soldiers who leave after 3 years have to return if the situation arises?
They would do. The reserve structure is still pretty much unchanged except for some cosmetics since Soviet times. So anybody who has been in the armed forces, which if you go back a generation is pretty much everybody, retains some kind of reserve obligation up until age 50 to 65, depending on what rank they reached. And they are calling up reserves more and more often. 2006, they had 700 exercises which involved calling up reserves. So the people who finish their contract service, if they decide not to re-enlist after their 3 years, they'll go back into that same pool, but they won't need as much of the refresher training that they're giving to the other reservists when they call them up.
Question 12. Is the transformation towards a more professional army accompanied by a change of military doctrine?
Yes, it seems to be. They haven't actually published their new military doctrine yet, but there are all sorts of leaks about what exactly it's going to contain. The key thing is a move away from generic threats like terrorism to putting USA back at the number one slot again and considering ways of countering threats which are coming closer to Russia's border. And if you think back to what they're actually redesigning the airborne assault forces for, it ties in with the new changes in the law which make it administratively permissible for the Russian president to deploy forces abroad, even if it means invading somebody.
Keir Giles can be contacted by email at Keir, spelt Kilo Echo India Romeo, .Giles, spelt Golf India Lima Alpha, @gmail.com.